Will Chen, welcome to Version Up.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm really excited to have this conversation. The topic for today is AI wrappers, and you seem like the perfect guest for this because you are launching something today that I think is maybe right on point.
Yeah, so I'm launching Mike. So the website is mikeoss.com. No relation to Mike Ross from Suits at all. OSS just means open source software. So Mike is meant to be an open source version of what Harvey and Legora have on their web app. So basically it has one-to-one feature parity. So you have your assistant, you have something like Vault. So I call it projects where you can upload your documents and you can create projects. And you also have tabular review. So basically, like for those who are not too familiar, it is just like sort of like an Excel table where you can upload tons of documents into them, and then you can have like a different prompt for each column, and then the AI just like iterates through all of the columns and all of the rows. So it's just a way for like lawyers to analyze tons of documents quite quickly, which is pretty common in due diligence, for example. And also their workflows. So workflows sort of like are just like instructions or prompts for the agent in the assistant, or they're basically sort of like column presets for the tabular review. So the whole idea is that well, just about like slightly more than a month back, I had a chance to sort of like look at Harvey and Legora, and the first thing that sort of like came to my mind was that I looked at these wrappers, right, and it just seemed to me to be incredibly thin. So what you have, as I previously as I've already described, right, is the assistant, tabular review, and projects, right. So it's really like there's not that much difference like from what you will actually get from for example ChatGPT or Claude, right. There are some sort of like more legal tailored workflows and also the tabular review, but really these things are not difficult to build. And therefore, the first thought that sort of came to my mind was that, I could probably build this with Claude in less than a month, maybe like 2 weeks. So in the end, right, it actually just took me about slightly more than 2 weeks to build the entire thing. And the second thought that came to my mind, right, was that, as software becomes commoditized, right? So as Claude or other coding agents like Codex get better and better, what we're seeing essentially is a commoditization of software. And we see this from sort of like the shift in VC investment trends. For example, now VCs like Sequoia or YC, they're trying to move forward to full stack companies. So companies that sort of like deliver like an end service, right? So Sequoia calls it, like the next sort of wave of software companies will be software companies that are masquerading as service companies, right? So I think directionally this sort of makes sense, right? Because where software is able to be like generated on the fly so rapidly, right, with all these coding agents, you sort of like have the commoditization of the wrapper layer. But at the same time, it sort of like stands really in contrast to what like Harvey and Legora are trying to sell, right? Because they're trying to sell these very expensive wrappers, right? They're trying to sort of like build as like very premium, like prestigious, if you go and look at like Harvey or Legora's website, it looks like the website of like a private resort or something like that, or a private members club. There's so much of this like prestige branding, and now they're getting all these like middle-aged actors and like golfers and whatever, Gabriel Marks and Jude Law, and I don't know how many like professional sports teams, right? But like to me, right, this just seems like a really stark contrast to where sort of like things are shifting, right? And because I believe that like the wrapper layer is going to start becoming commoditized, right? I believe that the wrapper layer, right, should not be sort of like hidden behind like $1,000 enterprise contracts, right? And that's the problem. That's the reason why I decided to just make my open source. So literally any law firm or just like any company, right, can just take it and then just like use it for themselves, right? So yeah, like that's sort of like the genesis of Mike. Basically two fundamental ideas. One is that the wrapper layer is becoming commoditized, and like software is becoming easier and easier to build, and therefore I wanted this to be Mike to be open source so that it's free and accessible to any law firm that wants access to it.
I want to red team that a little bit in a moment.
Yeah.
And I guess I want to be clear. I'm not shilling for anyone's product or service. And
Yeah. No
for me,
worries.
this is an interesting exploration of a very important topic,
Yeah.
and very excited to learn about what you're doing. Can you just tell me, how do you build something like this in 2 weeks?
Mhm. Yeah. So literally just with code. And Yeah, so the thing is that, I used to really be sort of like an AI coding agent skeptic, right? So when I left law, I sort of like tried to pick up coding really sort of like from the basics, right? I already had some coding experience before that, but I was like really just going through the tutorials, and I did the practice website. I coded every line hand by just by hand, right? And that was like just maybe about slightly more than a year ago. And since then, like the progress has just been amazing, genuinely amazing. And if you use Cloud or Codex, right, like half the time, it just generates like pretty good code that's immediately usable, right? And but half the time you do have to debug. So I would say that it is amazing, right? But you still need to have some sort of like coding knowledge. And if you're someone who doesn't understand code at all, it is going to be quite hard to just like completely vibe code. But at the same time, I really do have to emphasize that coding has been fundamentally changed, right? And you see like a lot of really seasoned, really senior software engineers come to the same conclusion as well. They start with skeptics, and eventually, a lot of them are now convinced, right? So yeah, so the whole process, right, was pretty simple. So I just started off, like writing a PRD, right? Like so I actually got Claude to just and ChatGPT to just like write out a description of the product, and like I'll just like do my little tweaks to it. I added a few screenshots about like what it should sort of like look like, and like from there, right, like Claude or just like generates a plan, and then I just ask it to execute, and like pretty fast, right? Like probably like in like half hour, right? It already sort of has like a like sort of like the shell of app, right, already there, and from there, right, it's just like a sort of iterative process, right? I just sort of like act as like a senior software engineer, right? I guess like a supervisor. I just tell Claude what to do, and it just sort of executes. But it's like oftentimes, right, things break and you have to debug. But it is very fast. Generally, it is really very fast. And before, like, okay, like you might say, okay, like this is safe, right? It's like byte coding safe. Yeah, there are many caveats, right? Obviously, there's like cybersecurity issues. Like like byte code oftentimes is like pretty buggy. Like, it's pretty buggy. It's pretty duplicative. So it is definitely so important to have that sort of like human intervention there. But at the same time, right? Like literally everyone's byte coding. Like Harvey and Legora are vibe coding. It's so obvious. Like when you go to the website, right, you see all the icons, you see like all the like little trademark little designs, right, that you can just tell, it's either Cloud or Codex that made it, right? And yeah, even like even like Fang, Facebook, I mean Meta, all these companies, right, they're using AI, and Meta in fact has like a sort of like a token quota that the software engineers has to use each day. So yeah, like everyone's vibe coding now. It's just sort of like it's like a weapon, right? It's like this, it's like this weapon, right? That now every software engineer has access to. I don't think like fundamentally it is bad anyway, but but it really just comes down to the user, right? Like you're responsible for the code that you put out. So yeah.
So let's talk about one part of your earlier answer, which had to do with the branding around some of these, let's call them brand name legal tech
Yeah.
tools. Branding matters in a couple of ways.
Mhm.
One that I could see it mattering is in reputation with regards to security. So
Yeah.
help me understand, if I were a lawyer and I went onto the mic tool today, what comfort would I get that I'm getting the right level of security with the data that I'm putting into the system?
So the website that I'm putting up right now is sort of like it's like a demo site. You can log in, and if you want to test it out, you can put your API keys. But the whole idea is actually that mic is supposed to be something that you run in your own law firm. So I'm putting up the whole entire code base is going to be on GitHub, and your firm can take it and you can run your intranet. You can run it locally, even on your own laptop. So yeah, that's my answer to security. But I would say that, one sort of like one sort of like advantage of it, right, is that it is open source, and therefore you can take the software and you can sort of like do whatever you want with it, right? So like you can run it in your firm intranet. You can just like hook it up with you can just run like a local version yourself, right? You don't even have to necessarily put it on the internet. Yeah. So the fact is, right, like right now it is open source, and it is up to people to decide whatever they want to do with it. Yeah.
What does the open source mean for cost? So if a user goes on mic, they pay for the token usage. How does that work?
Yeah, so if they're paying for the token usage, it just means that they are paying for just like by per token. So they are basically putting the API keys into Mike. And yeah, like they will be paying directly to Anthropic or to OpenAI. Yeah, so you're not paying anything to me, and I'm not taking cut of anything.
And how would you expect the cost to compare if you were to perform the same set of tasks? I know you haven't benchmarked this, but
Yeah.
would the cost be lower, the same, higher versus doing the same things on one of these mainstream tools?
Yeah, so I think, by definition, right, it's going to be lower because the sort of advantage of having direct access to an open source application data, right, just means that you only have to pay for the API costs. So what Harvey and Legora essentially do, right, is that they charge a markup, obviously. And so like Harvey, right, there are tons of numbers floating around. People are saying that, the official surveillance price for per seat per month is like $1,200. And for the Legora, I think it's probably like around maybe half of that. I've heard many different sums. And obviously, we don't really have any reliable values because because like all the countries are there and the NDA, right? So it's just rumors going around. And obviously, like the first year is going to be discounted and whatever. But like what these like sort of like rapper companies are doing, right, essentially is a pretty simple business model. Is that they are right, they're trying to offer like a fixed cost for now, which is advantageous to law firms, right? But so they can just like run as many queries as they want. So and I think a lot of like the law firms, they like this, right? But at the same time, like $1,000 or a few $100, that's massively above like the whatever price that Anthropic or OpenAI are charging for their enterprise seats, right? Which are probably around like, which I put is around like $200 a month for enterprise. So like right now, so to sort of like to sort of like summarize, right? So obviously, these companies, like for now, they are offering a fixed price, but even a fixed price it comes with a huge markup, right? Because they have to mark up whatever API costs they are incurring. But at the same time, right? I have heard, this has been discussed, like, from like the founders of Harvey and Legora, they are, considering moving towards a consumption-based model. Obviously, that's better for them because they don't have when your costs are fixed, right? You don't want your pricing to be fixed. And in the future, if they do move over to a consumption-based pricing, right, they would definitely just like be charging a certain like percentage, markup per token wise.
Let me pull a little more on the thread around the kind of branding, the premium kind of positioning.
Yeah.
Just thinking out loud, another, I guess, advantage or reason for that kind of branding might be that you're signaling to a certain kind of client base that you're dependable and seen as a premium corporate law firm. That might mean you want to use products and rely on tools that have the same sort of feeling, right? The same sort of branding. So if that's the case, is there a version of this where the brand name LegalTech tools like Harvey, Legora, there are others, they end up being used maybe by larger corporate kind of law firms, and open source tools like the one that you're putting out are something that maybe smaller firms use or independent practitioners use? I mean, is there sort of a bifurcation maybe in the market?
Yeah, I think it's certainly possible. So it did occur to me that, a lot of these sort of like small and medium-sized law firms, they definitely, could use something like Mike, right? Well, like, so I think it's just like, from a pricing standpoint, for a lot of them, like what was like Harvey and Legora trying to like offer, right? And they're trying to price themselves as like premium product, like beyond what you would get with like ChatGPT or Cloud, right? It's like probably beyond like your price range. So yeah, I could definitely see that happening. But I think, also at the same time, right? Big firms, they're sort of like the ones who have the sort of most resources, right? So they have the, legal engineers, they have software engineers. Tons of firms are recruiting for a lot of legal engineers these days. Like, for example, my former firm, I see them like putting out, like jobs for legal engineers or like product managers quite often these days. So yeah, like I think, for these big firms, right, one thing that they could definitely consider is that, perhaps they should be building their own application layer. Why should you be paying such a massive markup to Harvey and Agora? Like, the thing with Mike, right, is that, I built it sort of like to prove a point, right, that, the application layer is not difficult to build.
And so again, try to sort of red team it here. One thought that crossed my mind is that using one of these out of the box brand name LegalTech tools probably smoothens out the user experience as changes happen to the foundational models. Do you see a version of this where some of the value that maybe you're paying is because if you are a law firm and you have a partner using the tool, you probably want to make sure the experience is very much the same day to day, week to week.
Yeah.
If I were deploying technology at a large law firm, I'd be very concerned about inconsistency in the behavior of the solutions that I'm deploying. Users that are not super savvy might see that as a reflection of poor quality, that the tool's not working. And so to the extent that the underlying foundation models are always undergoing changes, is the smoothing out of that experience something that these platforms offer?
Yeah. So that's a good point you make, right? And I've heard this argument pretty often. And yeah, to be clear, I do think that, that there is some sort of advantage to sort of like, having this like sort of unified platform, right, where you can sort of like put all your files and all like all your folders, all your projects into, right, and then you get this like aggregator that gives you access to all of the latest models, right? But I think this is about advantage, right? But it is important to consider like what sort of like what it costs, So okay, firstly, right, the first cost that comes with this, right, is that just because like the Harvey and Legora have access to the API, right, doesn't mean that the agents, their assistant works as well as Claude or as ChatGPT. So actually, right, because I'm using coding tools quite often, I can see a real difference, right, between sort of like the pure play wrapper tools and Claude Code and Codex, right, which the model providers, the AI labs release themselves. So for some reason, right, obviously because I haven't done like a real detailed analysis of how like how exactly Claude Code works, right? Even though the code base was leaked a while back, but I haven't really like done a full analysis of this, right? But what really happened in the past few months, right, is that most software engineers have switched over to tools that are provided by the base model companies because they just seem to work better. And like how well an agent works, right, depends not just on the underlying model, right? It also depends on the prompts, right? The prompts you give it. It depends on the tools that you give it as well. And so, for example, Claude Code or Claude, right, has access to really advanced tools. So, for example, where if you just go to Claude.ai, right, and you ask it to, for example, like build an app, like or create a document or whatever, right? It just seems to work really well. And this translates into coding as well, right? It just seems to work better. Okay, so yes, you're not getting locked in to an API, but you're getting locked into an agent, right? And the agent is something that's on top of the API. And if you get a subpar agent, that's going to be something they're going to be stuck with, right? And one thing that I sort of heard pretty often from sort of like junior associates or mid-level associates who, like ever since I started posting on LinkedIn and also through my private contacts, right? I've heard this thing pretty often, right? Which is that, a lot of associates or just like junior partners, right? They wouldn't prefer to just have access to Claude or ChatGPT because they use it in their private lives, right? And somehow it just seems to work better than Harvey and Legora. Okay. So, and me personally, right, I've done some tests, right? For example, I asked Harvey and I asked ChatGPT the same question, right? About GDPR, so it's European legislation on data protection, right? And Harvey took like 30 seconds to think, right, to do a web search. And, ChatGPT gave the response almost immediately, right? And the substance of the response was the same, but the only real difference you see was like, that the wind emojis, like the response was more sort of like a more legal tone. And basically you can sort of like correct that with like a 2-line prompt, right? make your response in a formal legal tone, something like that. But that doesn't really improve the user experience for the user, because in my case, I would have preferred to just have the response like instantaneously, right, from ChatGPT. So I also had like experiences with just really strange experiences where, for example, I asked Harvey about a credit agreement, right, and it would tell me the parties were X and X, right, but when I click on the citation actually goes to like an assignment deed in the annex of the credit agreement, right? So obviously there's something wrong going on here. I'm not quite sure what. Probably prompts, probably the system prompts, or probably just like, the tools that the agent has to search the document. But there's something wrong that's going on. Okay, so that's the first point. Your work user experience does not equate to having that. It's not the same just because you have the same underlying model API access. The second point is that, okay, now you have, so like you're using this platform, right? You're putting all your documents, you're putting all of your projects in there, and obviously at Harvey and Legora, they want that for the users, right? So they want everything to be there. They want to be this like this centralized hub, right? That you get access to all of the APIs, right? Then what happens, right? If Harvey and Legora just doesn't work as well, right? Now you're locked in, and every year, right, your subscription payments keep going up and up and up and up, right? And this is already baked into the enterprise SaaS contracts. The first year they get a discount, second year they get slightly lesser discount, and price increase is going to come as the VC subsidies start reducing, right? So I think for right now you do have an advantage, right? But the law firms and always have to consider, this is sort of like switching. Is this sort of like this convenience, right? Of like, is it worth it? Like you have to balance the convenience, and sort of like the switching costs, right, between different products, with the sort of like quality of the output they're getting, right? Because the alternative, right, is that, okay, you use many different tools at the same time, right? So for example, a lawyer can use, Cloud Enterprise or like ChatGPT Enterprise. So there will be some switching costs. So you might have to like, copy and paste your files a little bit. But if you're getting a better result, I think 9 out of 10 lawyers will do that.
Well, I wonder whether a smart law firm can kind of have a best of both worlds approach, where frankly, they could use one of these out of the box brand label products for a year, learn a lot about how you can automate workflows. And if they're smart, they could continue using it for some applications or some use cases, and then start building their own on the side for things that are truly valuable, proprietary, the sort of real secret sauce for their practice or for their law firm. A balanced approach. It's not put everything on one legal tech platform, but it's also not, okay, everything is built, everything is going to be open source.
Yeah. So yeah, I think you make a good point, right? So definitely law firms, they can build their own custom tools, right? And that's sort of like the point that I'm trying to prove with Mike. It's not difficult to build these days, right?
Yeah.
And which is why, we see that enterprise SaaS valuations really just like crashing in the public market, right? But that's just what Harvey and by Harvey and Legora, they want the inverse, right? They want law firms to be building on top of their platform, right? So they want all of their workflows, they want all of their sort of like the custom tools to be built within the sort of Harvey and Legora ecosystem, And yeah, I know some law firms are sort of like trolling both Harvey and Legora now, right? But it's sort of the strategy of both like startups, right? To try to, get law firms to build on top of one of them, right? So that, first their data, right? So they do like law firms are encouraged to put their data into Harvey and Legora. And second is like, the custom tools, the custom workflows, like Harvey and Legora are trying to encourage law firms to build within the ecosystem, right? And, that just makes vendor lock-in, more and more permanent, right? And yeah, the sort of like risk of this is that, as I previously mentioned, right, you might just end up getting stuck with a subpart agent, right, that sits on top of all this, like pretty valuable firm IP, right, that you built for Harvey on top of Harvey and Legora. And that's a big risk, right? So Harvey and Legora, these days, I think they're pretty cognizant that, this sort of like software value proposition is dwindling, right? Because, you see Anthropic, right, partnering with Fresh Views. And I think, pretty soon, we'll see OpenAI as well try to get to the legal enterprise space. So they do see sort of like, the value proposition, right, of the pure sort of like software functionality fading away, right? So right now they're trying to sell themselves as more sort of like a services company, right? That they have forward deployed engineers that comes part of like enterprise pricing. But law firms have to be quite wary, right? That this sort of like service that you're trying to sell, right? Once again, right, is trying to lock you into the platform.
It's not clear how services scale. It's not my problem, but
Yep.
it certainly is a problem for the VC investors that are backing these companies. You have to assume that any attempt at services is a way to bridge you to something that's more like a product, to something that can
Yep.
scale more like a
Yep.
product. I don't know how you continue to have the growth and the valuations if you don't have that scalability. But let me go back to it's something really interesting that you've already covered here today, but the language you used in a LinkedIn post was this feeling by these products that are built on top of the foundation layers. There's an overfitting through system prompts, inefficient LLM calls, et cetera. And what I hear you describing is really that there's some sort of fundamental problem that anyone that builds on top of the foundation models faces, which is building on top of something that's changing all the time. And you don't even know how or why it's changing.
Yeah.
As things are changing underneath and the layer beneath you, you have to figure out what does that mean for your layer that's built on top of it. And maybe something like a prompt that you came up with 3 months ago that worked great for a previous version is now creating an issue for you in a new rollout of ChatGPT. On top of that, you have the frontier labs moving more clearly into the legal vertical. Those two forces seem like they're putting pressure on what you're calling the wrapper layer. One is a moving target, first of all, that they're working with. And secondly, that the moving target is also coming for them in a way, in a sense that could be competing for their clients. So is that the right way to think about it? And if it is, what does this mean for the legal tech space, do you think, for the next 6 months, 12 months, 18 months?
Yeah. So I actually wrote a LinkedIn post on this that was like pretty well received, right? So around like 500 likes, and so like well the core problem is that Harvey and Legora they are facing a problem that very few businesses ever face, right? Which is that essentially your supplier seems to almost offer equivalent or even better product than you do, right? If you sort of like go down to really like business basics, go back to first principles, right? You have to offer some sort of value add on top of like the raw product that you're buying from your supplier, right? So, if you just think about the most ubiquitous business, right? For example, the restaurant, it offers, cooking, right? It offers a nice environment, right, for you to dine in. But the problem with like Harvey and Legora right now is that this sort of like core service offering, right? Which is that they have the assistant, as previously mentioned, there's like some workflows and like tabular review, like all this stuff can be built very, very fast, right? Like the word add-in, and we have seen, Anthropic, building a word add-in, and Anthropic, is like invading multiple like enterprise verticals, right? And also consumer verticals because it's just so easy and fast to build software now, especially if you have top engineering talent like Anthropic does. So what like the sort of like functionality of the software, the value proposition, the lies that is being eroded away, right? And that is very, very clear. And I think in the next few months, right? I think we'll sort of like see possible response from law firms, right? Because right now, like it's sort of like industry consensus is that okay, like if you're a big law firm or like sort of like a like mid-tier law firm, that wants to like sort of like sell itself to like your client, right? And it's like AI enabled, right? You want to just like get maybe Harvey and Legora because they invested so much money into marketing, so much money into sales, just like positioning themselves as sort of like the premium choice, right, in legal tech. But the market changes really fast, right? And Harvey and Legora, both these companies have never truly been tested by not even one renewal cycle, right? So that renewal cycle is going to come up the first year. So most of these Harvey and Legora enterprise contracts, right, were signed about a year ago, right? And it's going to be a real test, And obviously, Harvey and Legora, they are trying to push out, a lot of features, right? You see them like, Harvey introducing Spectre or whatever, and and both companies are trying to add on harnesses, right? Like linking like your agent to like to iManage or to Outlook or whatever, right? So they try to like keep like a little distance, right, from like the supplier, right, the model companies, right? So just like think of it like a marathon, right? Like these model companies, they're like slowly catching up, right? And so like Harvey and Legora, they had to keep pushing, right, to try to like, keep the distance, right? Another way they try to do so, right, is like through their is through services, right? So you almost try to sell themselves as like a little bit like a mix between like a software and a services company now. Actually, they're getting tons of like push from their investors as Sequoia to try to differentiate themselves. But it still comes down to like, okay, is all this going to be enough to make up for perhaps like Claude and ChatGPT just being that bit better, right, than your agent, right? And I think that that's a real issue because like I do hear this complaint quite often, right, from associates that you know I wish I could just have Claude instead. I wish I could just have ChatGPT instead. And just a while back, right, I had a message from like from a senior associate at a mid tier firm, right, that was planning to get either Harvey or Legora, right, and he was like telling me that I'm like trying my best to like persuade the partners to just go with ChatGPT and Claude instead because they just work better, right? Like having like quite them hands on during the trial, So yeah, like the question, right, is that do all these sort of like differentiating factors that Harvey and Legora try to offer, right, put a meaningful the distance between like them and Anthropic or OpenAI? My feeling is maybe not because I know that like most associates, most lawyers, they don't really touch any of these. They just like give me workflows. Okay, they just ask the assistant a question, ask it to like review this document or whatever, right? And or they use the word adding pretty heavily. And these things are like Anthropic already has it. OpenAI, I assume that they're probably going to launch a word adding soon. And Anthropic and OpenAI, they can still introduce a tabular review, right? It literally took me like an afternoon to build tabular review. It's not difficult to build.
If ChatGPT and Claude go really hard into the legal vertical, I really accept your hypothesis. I really do. If the foundation models truly build out plug and play features that lawyers can use and deploy at their enterprises, I see your point. But so far, Claude is dipping their toes. We don't know how far they're going to go. And so for the time being, at least, I think the implicit assumption in your hypothesis is that a law firm can deploy ChatGPT or they can deploy Claude, and then they have to do something to build on top of that layer internally the full feature set that they need. Now, I get your point that you're saying, look, coding is cheap and it's easy and you don't need a lot of resources to do it. But I think you would agree, right, that there's an assumption there that to use today's out-of-the-box LLMs to have the kind of user experience that you get on some of these brand name legal tech platforms, you have to do some sort of building, right? And so then someone has to do that. So I guess my question for you is take your typical law firm. What assumptions are you making about, for example, the resources they need, the maintenance required to make sure that the experience is good for all the users based on where Claude and ChatGPT are today? How much are you expecting law firms to be able to do in order to create a user experience, let's say basically Mike, right? Create Mike within a law firm.
Okay, so I guess if a law firm wants to build some of its own like proprietary software, right? So it's like imagine like, okay, for example, the law firm wants to like build sort of like a corporate approvals generator, right? Something fairly simple, right? You could definitely like, get a few legal engineers, and some software engineers, just a small team, right? They can probably spin it up, in like in less than a week, right? So I think in the future, right, we could see a model, right, where essentially law firms, whenever they need some sort of like a custom application, right, they can just get their own sort of like in-house little team of like legal engineers and software engineers to just spin it up. So I know that like just even before all of this like AI revolution, right, that like many law firms, they already had some sort of like little internal like software engineering team, right? For example, I know they just had it, Latham had it, and yeah, I think AI will definitely enable more of this to happen, right? And I get what you're trying to say that okay, like perhaps Harvey and Legora, right? They have all these like software engineers. They have like and they're just so by fully dedicating the time and their efforts to help these law firms to build, right? So the lawyers just focus on billing, the law firms like sole role is just like offering legal advice. They don't need to like tend to like all these they don't have to maintain all the software, right, which takes time and effort. But so like my first answer to that, right, which I mentioned, is that okay, now it's become much easier to do so. You can do it for a small team. The second part of my answer, right, is that yes, okay, that is an advantage, right? But that's also a lock-in, right? Which I also mentioned before. So if you're constantly, sort of like going to like Harvey and Legora, asking them to, okay, build this for me, build that for me, right? And so you're sort of like locked into this enterprise contract. Obviously, like law firms, like big law firms, they are making billions of dollars a year, right? They can certainly afford that. But the question is that if you're a small law firm, right, say a mid-sized law firm, is that something that you'll be able to afford? And, is Harvey and Legora going to, sort of like give you the attention, right, to help you build all these tools, right? Harvey and Legora is they'll certainly put time and effort, right? They'll put people aside. They have teams dedicated to, your M-Law 100 law firms, right? Your V10 law firms, like Latham and Kirkland, for example. They'll certainly, I imagine if they want something to be built with Harvey, right, they can afford it in their enterprise contract, and they'll get the service, right? But I imagine that tons of sort of like just your mid-level law firms, they're not going to get these services, right? And neither can Harvey and Legora afford to, like provide all these like forward deployed engineers to these firms. So yeah, like and also thirdly, right, sort of to just add on, right, this sort of like assumption, right, prior to this is that OpenAI, right, or Anthropic, right, they're not interested in sort of like providing forward deployed engineers. They're not interested in providing services to enterprises, right? But the sort of like the Anthropic and Freshfields partnership, right, that we've seen recently, right, it's like proves the contrary, right? Because they very specifically said that it's a partnership, right? And Anthropic will be sending its engineers to work alongside Freshfields lawyers, and I think we're seeing this change, right? Because Anthropic and OpenAI, right, they're prepping for the for IPO, right, at a $1 trillion valuation, sorry. So they're sort of like in the state, right, where they have to increase the revenue as much as possible, right? And what better way to do it than to go to the enterprise vertical, right? Because consumers, they don't want to pay more than like $20 a month for a subscription, right? And consumers subscriptions are, subsidized. They were a way for like the both companies to get the name out to generate hype, right? And now it's time for them to really get the enterprise revenue going. So the sort of like assumption that these pure play rappers, right, can get by just by providing services, I think it's under question as well. And also, for one final point, right, there is real like sort of if you're talking about competition services, right, between pure play rappers and these model companies, right, my bet is that you're going to get better engineering from these model companies because they are truly hiring the best engineers in the valley with their compensation packages. I think we've just recently seen Anthropic hire multiple CTOs from leading startups, and all of them are joining just as member of technical staff, right? They call all the engineers member of technical staff. But the level of engineering talent that we see at these companies is truly unprecedented.
I wonder whether, using the phrase, the pure play rapper, it feels like it might be selling short a little bit of what some of these platforms offer, because as you were explaining what a law firm would do to kind of build these out on their own, I started wondering, well, is there an opportunity for someone to offer like an infrastructure layer? And then I thought, well, that is kind of what Harvey and Legora claim to be doing. So I think where we're headed is a universe where there's just different use cases and different products for different positioned law firms. I think there's law firms that have a lot of resources, are very sophisticated, very tech forward, have built out the infrastructure, who are going to go exactly the route that you described. I can see that already happening. I think it's going to be a really powerful thing for law firms to do, that have the resources and the will to do so. And then there's going to be a lot of law firms that don't have the resources or don't have the will internally, don't have the capacity. And I think those might be more likely to look to a third-party provider to really offer that infrastructure layer where you can do the customizations, you can do the automated workflows, but you don't need to worry about the user interface, user experience. Is it secure? Is it not? Maintenance, et cetera. So I just want to kind of push back a little bit on thinking about things too binary. Is the market more likely to be headed in a direction where different players are going to use different kinds of solutions? Because I will say that, like, thinking out loud here, this conversation really has me, there's a lot of spooling. So
Yeah.
thank you for that. Because where I am right now is, if these brand name legal tech tools, if they fail on performance, that's a huge problem,
Yeah.
right? If you're right that people find that using out of the box Claude is as good as something that's built on top of it, I think that's a huge problem. That's to me would be like the death knell. Okay, that's a theory. I don't know if it's proven, but let's just say that happened, that would be a huge problem. I think the cost is definitely an issue. Probably not as much of an issue as some people think, because premium law firms have quite a bit
Yeah, they can build
of
it.
resources, but it's definitely an issue, always an issue. So cost and performance, they have to nail that. If these products don't nail performance and cost, then they're in big trouble. But if they can show the performance and they can make the cost comparable or only a little bit more than the path where you're doing the own build out and all that, boy, I could see that being a sustainable model for a decent chunk of the law firm market. Not all of it, but for some chunk of it.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, I get what you're trying to say now. So yes, so you sort of like envision, sort of like imagining a world where, perhaps sort of like the top tier law firms, right? They can build their own like sort of like custom solutions. They don't even need to go with like Harvey and Legora. Whereas perhaps like the more sort of like mid-tier law firms that have like limited resources, they just get something out of the box, whether it's like Harvey Legora, like GCAI, whatever, like bunch of those like enterprise wrapper SaaS, right? Is that what we're trying to say?
I'm open to the idea that there's a spectrum here,
Yeah.
and it's going to include more options than I think just
Yeah.
no tool and tool, or no
Yeah.
vendor and vendor, and space for open source solutions. I'm seeing a lot of options ultimately.
Yeah, exactly right. So okay, like yeah, okay. So let me just try to. There's a lot here, right? Just like sort of like interject me if I'm just like getting a bit lost, but I try to like sort of like address it. So yes, like firstly about Mike, right? Yeah, the whole idea is that I'm sort of proposing a third way, right? Open source solution out there, anyone can build on top of it. It works. Well, like you can install in your law firm, get it working on the internet, perfectly secure. Yeah, and yeah, that is potentially a way, right? So, for example, if you're a law firm that has like software engineers, that has legal engineers, you can build on top of it. You're not locked into any vendor. Okay, Harvey and Legora. Harvey and Legora, yes, I can see some law firms still going for it because definitely you have the marketing, you have the sales, you have the customer service, you have the forward deploy engineers. I feel like for a lot of like law firm like sort of like technology leaders or partners, right? I guess that is kind of assuring, right? You have all this attention, right? Especially if you're top M100 law firm, right? Yeah, I could see that some law firms still sticking with them, right? But obviously the big caveat, right, is that if the tools just don't work as well as ChatGPT or Claude, right? And we're already seeing that, right? Sort of like well, firstly, right, your lawyers aren't getting the best results, right? And it's going to affect the work they give to your clients, right? And secondly, right, that's going to affect market perception, right? Why your clients will be like, okay, why are you not sort of like getting the most premium tool in the market, right? So right now, like Freshers looks incredibly smart because they're the only ones that has Anthropic partnership, right? That makes them really stand out in the market. And when they go to clients, right, that's going to be a massive sell, right? I assume the Fresher partners, right, they're incredibly proud of this and just smirking to clients, right? Hey, we are the only one that has partnership among all the law firms with the top AI company in the world right now, right? That has the best model, like by far, right? And whereas all the other law firms, right, you just have Harvey and Legora, like it's just a rapper. These are just rapper startups started by some 20-year-olds that vibe coded these applications, right? And so yeah, firstly, so like market perception is going to change as well. Okay, so and also right, so yes, those are the two caveats we're going with Harvey and Legora. And that's sort of like so like yeah, like you also mentioned that okay, like law firms they want to have this sort of like prepackaged like working solution that's like out of the box, and it has like some sort of like legal related tooling, right? It's like specific to the legal vertical, right? Rather than just like out of the box ChatGPT and Claude, right? Because ChatGPT and Claude, it's not really legal anyway, right? Yeah, of course. But question, right? Are all these add-ons actually that important, right? Because when I talk to a lot of associates, right? What they really use in Harvey and Legora is really just the assistant, right? And you have this really funny sort of like a phenomenon, right? Where a lot of the praise for Harvey and Legora is coming from people who don't use AI that much. So it's like your partners and or like your like late 30s senior associate who just isn't really familiar with AI. They don't really know how it works. They don't know like quite what an API is. They don't know what a token is. And for them, right, Harvey and Legora is like the first time you come into contact with AI, right? And frankly, I'm surprised, right? Because back in when I was still later, right? I still remember like this is like late 2024, right? And I was like talking to my colleagues about ChatGPT, right? And most of them have not heard about it. And suddenly now the partners have heard of it, right? It was just not a thing on anyone's radar, right? But even now, right, the problem still sort of persists, right? So you have like lawyers who say, well, like having Go idea is saving me so much time, I'm using it for proofreading, like it's helping me to pick up grammar mistakes. Problem is you can do all of that in ChatGPT and Claude. So there's like this sort of like perception gap, right? I think, people think that, oh, it's like Harvey and Legora, there's like, like giving me all this like time savings of work, right? But really, you could have just gotten it with ChatGPT and Claude. But it's just that these people don't know it, right? But, slowly, right, this is going to change, right? Because like even my parents, right? Or, just like you see, right? Like it's sort of like AI has become sort of from a thing where, just tech people knew about, to like young people knew about. Not everyone is using it, and I assume that, soon we have like, partners like, like using AI in your own personal life, right? For like recipes or whatever, and you're going to start realize, oh, wow, like ChatGPT is so fast, it's like so much faster than the Harvey, right? So like the question is, right, this sort of like all this like custom, like legal stuff, like this like, but like building the vertical, right? These custom like vertical specific features, right? Enough of like a differentiator, right? And I also want to add on a final point, right? Is that like there's like this a lot of like this like selling about like workflows, right? Like legal workflows, okay? But you don't see that in like the software engineering world, right? For example, you don't like code or like codex. It doesn't come with workflows for writing Python. There's not like one specific workflow for writing, like for example, it's like JavaScript. There's not some workflow for creating a website. There's not some workflow for creating a table. No, you just ask AI to do it and it just does it, right? Because it's already baked into the training, right? And so all this workflows, right? I feel like maybe this is it just reminds me a little bit of like back in like 2024, right? There's this whole wave of like prompt engineers are going to be the future like software engineer, right? And so like there were certain companies who were like paying quite high salaries, like it's $300,000 for people to just write prompts every day because AIs back then were not smart enough. I think we could see the same thing with workflows, right? All these workflows that they are building, it might just be for nothing because a year from now, right, AI is just going to know how to review SPA. It's going to know how to review like a lease agreement. You don't have to have a specific workflow for that.
I was going to say that is the key baked in assumption there is that the trajectory and the improvement of the underlying foundation models continues, right?
Yeah.
And if it does, and this is why whenever I talk about what does AI mean for the legal market, it's like once you get to that part of the conversation, you can just flip the table over and start everything over from scratch. Because if the foundation models get that good, where you prompt it to answer a legal question the way you prompt it to answer a coding question, that would completely blow up all these business models, right? I don't think anyone will question that. But if they stay on the trajectory they're on, and let's say for the foreseeable future, they are the way they are, I think the answer to the workflows question is, look, a lot of what lawyers do is pretty complicated. It can't be done just by prompting ChatGPT. And so you need to have some legal person who knows how to answer a legal question involved in building something on top of the foundational model to answer the question. And so my personal view, if you're talking to those partners, because I love your point about that difference in the senior associate versus the partner, I think there's 3 points that will land with the partners. One is cost. Cost will always land with people who, have equity in the business. The other, I think, is the lock-in, right? I think what we haven't explored, but it's in the background, is these brand label legal tech platforms. Are they going to be competing with some of these law firms by selling to corporate in-house departments? And then there's, as part of that, if you're giving away your absolute secret sauce to anyone, I think every partner at every law firm inherently knows that that could be an issue and a risk. And you don't have to, I think, get into too much technical jargon to help them understand that. People who run law firms understand that you wouldn't want to give it all away to someone else because that's your competitive advantage. So I think that kind of language might be more effective when talking to the leadership at law firms.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a great point. And just to add on to that, right, I think one sort of like risk that law firms have really considered yet is that, what if Harvey and Legora, they start offering services, right? Like legal services, right?
Yeah.
So, there's like this whole push for like AI native law firms, and every day we're seeing like a new AI native law firm, sorry, come out like stealth mode, and they have like raised like $60 million or $50 million, and yeah, like it's because all the VC money is like flowing towards that, right? And obviously we know that like Harvey and Legora, they're not profitable, they're burning cash at a really rapid rate. I wouldn't be surprised at all if both these companies just like shift to offering legal services, right? They already have tons of associates that they hired, and also they have tons of partners, right? They've been hiring, famous, like well recruited partners, right, to help them to sell the software. But if they have the money, right, and they already have the talent, I could definitely see them, starting to offer, legal services in like an AI native law firm branch of their company. So
Yeah.
law firms have to be aware, are you maybe just like giving away your secret sauce?
Where do you think this leaves legal tech vendors in the near term, medium term? What does the legal tech vendor of tomorrow look like? Is it a service provider who's really helping with those forward deployed engineering or helping build out the infrastructure layer at a law firm or a legal enterprise? Is it someone building a super niche tool that addresses some very specific workflow that ChatGPT is not going to figure out anytime soon? If you were advising a legal tech vendor or someone who's thinking about investing and starting a legal tech startup, what would you tell them?
Yeah, I think you have to be like pretty specialized, right? So my sort of I'm not like sort of anti legal tech in general, right? Yeah, I think I'm sort of like bearish on Legora Harvey because really the sort of like tools that they're offering, right? For example, like a general like an agent, right? Is it really a legal agent? Like it's not that different from Claude Cowork or from Claude ChatGPT, right? Tablet review, you can build an afternoon, projects, like ChatGPT has projects, you can upload your documents, Claude has projects as well. Like these are not really very specific, right? These are just like really like general some tools, right? Like that, frankly, anyone can use, right? And I've heard, like assistant law firm leaders tell me that, because they only provided a tool to like to lawyers, right? And they sort of like think okay, like should I also just be like rolling out throughout the firm, like just maybe giving it to like maybe the secretarial staff as well, because these tools I don't really see how particularly like exactly legal it is, right? But if you're building like sort of like a legal tech startup, right, that is really sort of quite addressing quite a hard problem, right? That is not just sort of like ChatGPT or Claude with like some legal sort of like marketing on top, right? Like some sort of like tiny little tweaks on top. Like for example, you like I know e-discovery, for example, is a huge problem, right? That like I've heard tons of lawyers have gripes, with like existing e-discovery providers, and yeah, like I think if you're trying to solve like a really specific problem, really specialized problem that law firms have, I think there's still going to be a market, right? But if you're just sort of like offering a very sort of like general tool, like an agent that works with harnesses, that works with like your CMS, that works with Outlook, like Atropic's building that. So it's better to sort of like sort of like try to go into more specialized verticals when like the wallet providers are going for like the most of like generalized, like but like legal sort of vertical right now. I don't know if that makes sense. Yeah.
It does. Or something more service-like, something more consulting-like. You're helping deploy agents, you're helping automate workflows, things that may not be as necessary in a year or two if the foundational LLMs get really good. But for now, I think that's a huge value add for most legal enterprises that lack that capacity internally.
Yep, exactly.
Will, thank you so much. This is such a difficult topic, honestly, but such an important one. It's been really helpful for me to kind of tease it out with you. I really closely follow you on LinkedIn, find your content to be extremely engaging, thought-provoking. Can you just tell us, where can we find you? Tell us a little bit more about yourself.
You can find me on LinkedIn. So I'm just Will Chen on LinkedIn. And you can find me on X as well. So my handle is at WillChen500 on X.
Excellent. All right. Thanks so much for coming on, Will.
Yeah. And thank you, Kai.